I never imagined that the day would come when my wife, Lisa, would go to such extremes. The sharp sting of the hot tea on my face was nothing compared to the words she spat with venomous confidence. "Give your parents' house to my brother, or I will divorce you," she demanded, her tone dripping with entitlement. It wasn't a request, it was a threat. For a moment, I just stared at her, letting the absurdity of her ultimatum sink in. This wasn't about the house. It was about power, control, and her complete disregard for what mattered to me. My response was calm, colder than the tea that now stained my shirt. "Yes," I said simply. The word caught her off guard, her smirk fading slightly as she tried to interpret my meaning. She thought she had won, that I would crumble under the weight of her threat. Little did she know, that single word wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of my liberation. I couldn't shake the image of my parents, standing proudly in front of the house they had worked so hard to build. It wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was a monument to their perseverance, a legacy they entrusted to me. And now, Lisa wanted me to hand it over to her brother, Greg, a man who had never worked a day in his life, whose arrogance was only matched by his laziness. As Lisa stormed out of the room, leaving behind a tense silence, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't the first time she had made unreasonable demands, but this was the first time she crossed a line I couldn't ignore. Her lack of respect for my values, my family, and my boundaries had become glaringly obvious. For years, I had compromised, bent over backward to accommodate her whims, but this was the final straw. Later that evening, as I cleaned up the mess from her outburst, I couldn't help but reflect on how we had gotten here. When we first got married, Lisa was charming, driven, and full of life. I fell for her confidence, mistaking it for strength. Over time, though, that confidence morphed into entitlement, and her charm became a weapon she wielded to get what she wanted. I ignored the red flags, convincing myself that love was about making sacrifices. But now, standing in the quiet of our kitchen, I realized I had sacrificed too much. That night, I barely slept. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. I couldn't let Lisa and Greg trample over my parents' legacy, but I also couldn't ignore the reality of my marriage crumbling before my eyes. The pain of her betrayal was sharp, but underneath it was a growing resolve. If she wanted to play games, I would play smarter. By morning, Lisa had packed a bag and announced she was going to stay with Greg for a few days. She didn't bother to hide her smugness, assuming that her absence would make me desperate to appease her. I watched her leave without a word, the door slamming shut behind her. As the sound echoed through the house, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. The toxic energy she carried with her was gone, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I sat down at the dining table, staring at the family photos that lined the walls. My parents' smiles reminded me of the values they instilled in me: hard work, integrity, and resilience. This house was a symbol of everything they stood for, and I wasn't going to let Lisa or Greg tarnish it. It was time to take control of my life and my legacy. Pulling out my laptop, I began researching legal options. If Lisa was serious about her ultimatum, I needed to be prepared. I called my lawyer and scheduled a meeting, determined to protect what was rightfully mine. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity and setting boundaries that should have been established long ago. As the sun set that evening, I sat alone in the house, the silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel defeated or lost. Instead, I felt a quiet determination. Lisa thought she held all the cards, but she had underestimated me. This was just the beginning of a battle I intended to win. The house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a testament to my parents' sacrifices. Every time I walked through its doors, I was reminded of my father's long hours at the factory and my mother's relentless budgeting to ensure we could afford a place to call our own. It was where we celebrated birthdays, where my parents taught me the value of hard work, and where they dreamed of the life they had built continuing through me. Now, Lisa and her brother, Greg, wanted to rip that legacy apart, reducing it to just another asset for their selfish whims. Sitting in the living room, I found myself running my hand over the edge of the coffee table my father had built. Every inch of this house told a story, and it infuriated me to think Greg, who had never lifted a finger to earn anything, felt entitled to it. He was a man who floated through life on the coattails of others, always looking for the next handout. He had no respect for the sweat and effort it took to build something meaningful. And Lisa, who once claimed to love the history of this home, was now eager to gift it to him as though it was hers to give. The idea of Greg lounging in my father's favorite armchair, barking orders as though he owned the place, made my blood boil. I could see it clearly, Greg hosting his freeloading friends, treating the house like his personal kingdom while Lisa applauded his every move. The thought of my parents' cherished home being desecrated like that was unbearable. I tried to wrap my head around Lisa's audacity. How could she ask me to give up something so precious, so deeply tied to my identity? Did she truly not understand what this house meant to me? Or worse, did she understand and simply not care? Her entitled demand was more than an attack on my family's legacy. It was an attack on who I was. The conversations between us had grown colder since her ultimatum. When I brought up the sentimental value of the house, she brushed it off. "It's just a house, David. Why are you being so dramatic?" she said with an exaggerated sigh. Her words cut deep. How could someone I shared my life with trivialize something so important? Her insistence that Greg needed it more was laughable. What Greg needed was a job and a sense of responsibility, not a handout at my family's expense. As the days passed, I noticed how Lisa tried to manipulate the situation further. She began painting Greg as a victim, claiming he was struggling and that family helps family. The irony wasn't lost on me. She didn't seem to care about my family or the sacrifices they made. Her definition of family was clearly limited to whoever served her agenda. When I reminded her of the promises I made to my parents to protect this house, she dismissed it as sentimental nonsense. "You can always buy another house," she said one evening, her tone dripping with condescension. "This one isn't even that modern. Greg could really fix it up." Her complete disregard for the emotional and historical value of the home left me speechless. To her, it was just a piece of property. To me, it was a legacy. Then there was Greg himself. His smugness was almost unbearable. He started showing up unannounced, casually walking through the house as though it was already his. "This place has potential," he said one afternoon, running his hand along the kitchen counter. "Might knock down this wall, make it open concept." He grinned at me as though he expected me to applaud his vision. I bit my tongue, but inside, I was seething. The sheer arrogance of it all was staggering. It became clear that Lisa and Greg had no intention of backing down. Their entitlement knew no bounds, and they were determined to wear me down until I gave in. But they underestimated me. They thought my silence was weakness, that my reluctance to engage in their schemes meant I was on the verge of surrender. In reality, I was planning my next move. I spent hours going through old photo albums, letters, and documents that my parents had left behind, reminding myself of the life they built and the principles they lived by. This house wasn't just a structure. It was a symbol of everything they stood for. Letting it fall into the hands of people who had no respect for it wasn't an option. One night, as Lisa and Greg huddled in the corner of the living room discussing renovation ideas, I excused myself and headed to my office. I dialed my lawyer, a trusted family friend who had helped my parents secure the property years ago. "I need to ensure this house stays in the right hands," I told him. He didn't hesitate. "We'll make sure of it," he said firmly. As I hung up the phone, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Lisa and Greg could scheme all they wanted, but they had underestimated the depth of my resolve. This house was more than a possession. It was a promise to my parents. And I intended to keep that promise, no matter what it took. The night Lisa stormed out with her suitcase, slamming the door behind her, should have felt like a defeat. But instead, it felt like the first deep breath I had taken in weeks. The oppressive weight of her demands, her constant manipulations, and Greg's entitled presence in my home were gone. For the first time, the house felt like mine again, quiet, undisturbed, and peaceful. That night, I sat in my father's old armchair, surrounded by the echoes of their absence, and reflected on how I had let things spiral so far out of control. Lisa's ultimatum, give Greg the house or I'll leave, had shattered whatever illusion of partnership we still had. Her departure wasn't a shock. It was inevitable. She thought her threat would force me into submission, that I would chase after her with an apology or, worse, give in to her demands. But I didn't. I sat in that armchair, staring at the family photos lining the mantel, and felt something unexpected: clarity. This wasn't about a house anymore. It was about respect, or rather, the lack of it. Lisa didn't just disregard my feelings. She disrespected my parents' legacy, our marriage, and me. Her audacity to leave and stay with Greg only solidified what I already knew. She was more invested in enabling her brother's failures than she was in preserving the life we had built together. As the hours ticked by that night, I realized that her leaving wasn't the end of something precious. It was the start of reclaiming everything I had lost: my dignity, my sense of self, and my peace. The next morning, I woke up to the sun streaming through the living room window, the warmth of its light a stark contrast to the coldness I had grown accustomed to with Lisa. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, staring at the yard where my father used to tinker with his old car on weekends. I thought about the lessons he had taught me about resilience, standing my ground, and never letting anyone take advantage of what's yours. That was the man he raised me to be, and I wasn't about to let him down. As the days passed, I started to see my marriage to Lisa in a new light. The cracks had always been there: her obsession with status, her need for control, her subtle but persistent prioritization of her family over ours. I had ignored the signs, excused her behavior, and convinced myself that love meant compromise. But this wasn't compromise. This was exploitation. The house dispute wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of me giving too much and her taking everything she could. It wasn't long before Greg started showing up again, knocking on the door and acting like nothing had happened. "She's just upset," he said casually, leaning against the doorframe. "You know how women are." His arrogance was infuriating, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I smiled and said, "This is between Lisa and me. You should stay out of it." He shrugged, smirking as though he had already won. But he hadn't seen the fire burning inside me, the resolve to put an end to this nonsense once and for all. Lisa's texts began to roll in a week later, a mix of guilt-tripping and veiled threats. "We're family," she wrote. "You're being unreasonable." Another message read, "If you don't fix this, you'll regret it." Her attempts to manipulate me only strengthened my resolve. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded every message to my lawyer, who assured me we were building a solid case to protect the house and my assets from any potential legal challenges. For the first time, I felt like I was taking control. I started making plans, not just for the house but for my future. I contacted contractors to evaluate the property, considering ways to preserve it and honor my parents' memory. I even began looking into local historical societies that might help me restore the home to its former glory. The idea of turning the house into a symbol of my family's legacy, untouched by Lisa and Greg's greed, gave me a renewed sense of purpose. Lisa, meanwhile, seemed to be growing more desperate. Her calls increased, alternating between pleading and accusing. "You're destroying this family," she said during one particularly heated voicemail. But what family was she talking about? The one where I was supposed to hand over everything I valued to her brother while she stood by and watched? No, that wasn't a family. That was a dictatorship, and I was done being ruled. One evening, as I locked the door and turned off the lights, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked tired but resolute. The man staring back at me wasn't the same person who had quietly endured Lisa's manipulations for years. He was someone who had finally drawn a line in the sand. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to fight, not just for the house but for myself. When Lisa stormed out, she thought she had the upper hand. To her, leaving was a power play, a way to bend me to her will. But what she didn't realize was that her ultimatum had only solidified my resolve. I wasn't going to crumble under her threats or give in to her demands. Instead, I was going to make sure that everything my parents worked for was protected, no matter what it took. The first step was to get my legal affairs in order. I made an appointment with my family lawyer, Mr. Daniels, a no-nonsense man in his 60s who had been handling my parents' affairs for decades. Sitting in his leather-upholstered office, surrounded by shelves of neatly organized law books, I laid out the situation. Daniels listened intently, his brow furrowing as I recounted Lisa's demands and her brother Greg's sense of entitlement. "This isn't just about the house," I said, my voice steady but firm. "It's about honoring my parents' legacy and making sure their hard work doesn't get squandered." Daniels nodded. "You're doing the right thing by coming to me now," he said. "We'll make sure everything is airtight. The house is your inheritance, and no one, not your wife, not her brother, has any legal claim to it unless you let them." Hearing those words gave me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in weeks. Daniels walked me through the steps we would take: transferring the house into a trust, updating my will, and documenting everything to ensure that no loophole could be exploited. By the time I left his office, I felt like I was finally in control. But I knew I couldn't stop there. Lisa was cunning, and Greg was relentless. They weren't the type to give up easily, especially when they believed they were entitled to something. I needed to stay one step ahead, so I started quietly preparing for the next phase of my plan. The first thing I did was make an inventory of everything in the house that held sentimental value. My father's watch, my mother's jewelry, family photo albums, and even the old toolbox my dad used to keep in the garage. I carefully packed these items and moved them to a secure storage unit. If Lisa and Greg were going to come after the house, I wasn't going to let them take anything that truly mattered to me. Next, I began researching the real estate market. If it came down to it, I was prepared to sell the house. It wasn't an easy decision. The thought of letting go of the place where I grew up, where my parents had built a life for us, felt like a betrayal. But I realized that the house wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of their love and hard work. As long as I protected their legacy, the physical structure didn't matter as much. Selling the house would ensure that neither Lisa nor Greg could ever lay claim to it, and it would give me the resources to start fresh. In the meantime, I played the part of the clueless husband. Lisa started texting me, pretending to be conciliatory. "I think we need to talk," one message read. Another said, "I know we've had our differences, but I believe we can work this out for the sake of our marriage." I didn't buy it for a second. Her sudden change in tone wasn't about saving our relationship. It was about getting what she wanted. Greg, on the other hand, was more brazen. He showed up at the house unannounced one evening, a smug grin on his face. "Just checking on things," he said, as if he had any right to be there. I stood in the doorway, blocking his path. "There's nothing here for you to check on," I replied. He laughed and said, "We'll see about that." As frustrating as their behavior was, it only fueled my determination. I kept my plans to myself, knowing that any misstep could give them the upper hand. The more they pushed, the calmer I became. I knew that every move I made was bringing me closer to securing the future I wanted, one free from their toxic influence. One evening, as I sat in the living room, reviewing the paperwork Daniels had prepared, I felt a sense of clarity wash over me. For years, I had let Lisa and her family chip away at my confidence, making me doubt myself and my decisions. But now, I was reclaiming my power. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about standing up for myself and refusing to let anyone take advantage of me again. When Lisa returned a week later, acting as if nothing had happened, I greeted her with a calm smile. She had no idea what was coming. "We need to talk," she said, her tone casual but calculated. I nodded. "We do," I replied, my voice steady. She thought she still had control, but little did she know, the game had already changed. I was no longer playing defense. I was ready to take the lead. When Lisa returned, she acted as if nothing had happened, as though her ultimatum and the chaos she'd left in her wake were just minor hiccups. She walked into the house with an air of entitlement, her confidence intact, as if she expected me to fall in line with her demands. For a moment, I almost admired her audacity. Almost. "I've been thinking," she began as she set her purse down on the kitchen counter, her tone nonchalant. "We need to figure out a way to make things work. For us, for Greg, for everyone involved." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to show her hand. Lisa hated silence. It made her nervous, and she quickly filled the void. I know you care about this house, but Greg and I have been talking. He's been going through a rough time, and it's not like we don't have enough space here. Maybe we can come to a compromise, she suggested, her voice dripping with faux sincerity. It took everything in me not to laugh. The manipulation was so blatant it was almost comical. But I kept my expression neutral, playing the part of the considerate husband. What kind of compromise are you thinking? I asked, my tone calm. Her eyes lit up, mistaking my question for willingness to cooperate. Well, Greg could move in temporarily, just until he gets back on his feet. And eventually, maybe we could transfer the house to him. You know, as a gesture of goodwill. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms as I studied her. She truly believed that her brother's entitlement was a valid argument, that his so-called struggles justified taking over a home that wasn't hers to give. And what happens to us? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Lisa waved her hand dismissively. Oh, we'd still live here, of course. It's just a matter of making room for family. Greg has always been family. Family. The word stung. My parents had built this house with their bare hands, pouring their love and labor into every brick, every beam. It was their legacy, and Lisa was talking about it as if it were a disposable piece of property to be handed off to her brother. My silence stretched on, and I saw a flicker of unease cross her face. Don't you want to support family, David? She pressed, her voice laced with faux concern. This is about doing the right thing. I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. I'll think about it, I said, my voice even. It was the answer she wanted to hear, and it was enough to satisfy her, for now. Over the next few days, Lisa's manipulation ramped up. Greg started showing up more frequently, walking through the house like he owned the place. He would make comments about renovations he'd like to make, pointing out areas he thought were wasted potential. One afternoon, I caught him in my father's study, rifling through papers as if he had any right to be there. What are you doing? I asked sharply, my voice cutting through the air like a blade. Greg jumped, his face flushing with guilt before he quickly masked it with a grin. Just looking for some paperwork Lisa mentioned. Nothing serious. I stepped into the room, closing the door behind me. This is my house, Greg. My parents' house. You don't touch anything without my permission. His grin faltered, but he recovered quickly. Hey, no need to get defensive. Lisa said we're all family here. I'm just trying to help. The audacity of his words almost made me laugh. Instead, I fixed him with a steady gaze. If you're so concerned about family, maybe you should focus on getting your own place instead of staking a claim to mine. Greg's face darkened, but he didn't respond. He left the study, muttering under his breath, and I locked the door behind him. The games continued. Lisa alternated between charm and guilt, trying to wear me down. She would cook elaborate meals, acting as if everything was normal, only to bring up Greg's situation at the dinner table. He's really struggling, David, she would say, her voice tinged with faux sadness. He just needs a little help to get back on his feet. And then there were the guilt trips. I can't believe you'd turn your back on my family after everything we've been through. Don't you care about us? About me? Her words might have worked in the past, but not anymore. I let her talk, let her try to manipulate me, all the while finalizing my plans in secret. The house was already in a trust, the sale lined up, and every move they made only reinforced my decision. They thought they were winning, but they didn't realize the game was already over. As I watched Lisa and Greg circle like vultures, I felt a strange sense of calm. Their desperation was becoming more apparent with each passing day, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down on them. For now, I let them play their games, knowing that the end was near. 2 weeks after Lisa and Greg's return, the house sale was finalized. I had worked quickly, leveraging the connections and expertise my parents had instilled in me over the years. The buyer was someone who appreciated the craftsmanship and history of the home, promising to preserve its character and integrity. For me, that was enough. It wasn't just about the money. It was about ensuring my parents' legacy wasn't sullied by greed. The morning the for sale sign went up on the front lawn, I waited with quiet anticipation. I had deliberately chosen a time when Lisa and Greg would be out running errands, so their return would coincide with the sign's reveal. I wanted them to see it immediately, to feel the weight of their assumptions crumble beneath them. When they pulled into the driveway that afternoon, their faces were a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Greg got out of the car first, walking toward the sign as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He stared at it for a long moment, then turned back to Lisa, who was frozen in place. Lisa stormed into the house, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. I was waiting for her in the living room, sipping coffee and reading through some paperwork as if it were just another normal day. The slam of the front door echoed through the house, and I looked up, feigning mild surprise. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fury. She pointed out the window toward the sign. I set my coffee cup down slowly, meeting her glare with a calm expression. "It's exactly what it looks like," I replied. "The house is sold." Her face contorted with a mixture of shock and anger. "You had no right. This is our home." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words hang in the air before responding. "It's my home, Lisa. It's always been my home. And since you made it clear that you wanted nothing to do with it unless it benefited your brother, I decided to make a decision that honors what this house really stands for." Greg came barreling into the room, his usual smugness replaced by panic. "You can't just sell the house," he shouted. "Where are we supposed to go?" I turned my attention to him, my voice calm but firm. "You've been living in a fantasy, Greg. This house was never yours to claim. You've been circling like a vulture, waiting for something that was never going to happen." Lisa stepped in, her tone desperate now. "David, we can talk about this. You didn't have to make such a rash decision. We're your family." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of her words. "Family? Is that what you call this?" Because from where I'm standing, all I've seen is entitlement and manipulation. "You threatened to leave me over this house, Lisa. You made your priorities clear." She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. "And let's not forget your ultimatum. Give him the house or I'll divorce you." "Well, Lisa," I chose. "And now you're going to live with the consequences of your actions." Greg tried to jump in again, but I silenced him with a look. "This conversation doesn't involve you. Pack your things and leave. You have no business here anymore." The weight of my words seemed to hit them both at once. Lisa's face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw something resembling regret in her eyes. But it was too little, too late. Greg, on the other hand, was furious, muttering curses under his breath as he stormed out of the room. Lisa stayed behind, her tone softening as she tried a different tactic. "David, please. Let's talk this through. I know I said things in the heat of the moment, but we can fix this." I shook my head. "There's nothing to fix, Lisa. You made your choice when you put your brother's greed above our marriage, above my parents' legacy. This house deserved better than to be a pawn in your games." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she seemed truly defeated. "Where are we supposed to go?" she whispered. "That's not my concern anymore," I said, standing up. "You wanted control, Lisa. Now you have it, over your own life, not mine." The following days were filled with chaos as Lisa and Greg scrambled to figure out their next move. They tried to stall, claiming they needed more time to pack, but I made it clear that the timeline was non-negotiable. Every box they loaded into their car felt like a step closer to freedom. The day they finally left, I stood on the front porch, watching as they drove away. Lisa didn't look back, but I could see the tension in her posture, the weight of her choices bearing down on her. Greg was sullen and silent, his dreams of an easy life shattered. As their car disappeared down the street, I turned back to the house, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The house wasn't mine anymore, but the legacy it represented was intact. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally move forward. 2 weeks after Lisa and Greg's return, the house sale was finalized. I had worked quickly, leveraging the connections and expertise my parents had instilled in me over the years. The buyer was someone who appreciated the craftsmanship and history of the home, promising to preserve its character and integrity. For me, that was enough. It wasn't just about the money. It was about ensuring my parents' legacy wasn't sullied by greed. The morning the "For Sale" sign went up on the front lawn, I waited with quiet anticipation. I had deliberately chosen a time when Lisa and Greg would be out running errands, so their return would coincide with the sign's reveal. I wanted them to see it immediately, to feel the weight of their assumptions crumble beneath them. When they pulled into the driveway that afternoon, their faces were a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Greg got out of the car first, walking toward the sign as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He stared at it for a long moment, then turned back to Lisa, who was frozen in place. Lisa stormed into the house, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. I was waiting for her in the living room, sipping coffee and reading through some paperwork as if it were just another normal day. The slam of the front door echoed through the house, and I looked up, feigning mild surprise. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fury. She pointed out the window toward the sign. I set my coffee cup down slowly, meeting her glare with a calm expression. "It's exactly what it looks like," I replied. "The house is sold." Her face contorted with a mixture of shock and anger. "You had no right. This is our home." I leaned back in my chair, letting her words hang in the air before responding. "It's my home, Lisa. It's always been my home. And since you made it clear that you wanted nothing to do with it unless it benefited your brother, I decided to make a decision that honors what this house really stands for." Greg came barreling into the room, his usual smugness replaced by panic. "You can't just sell the house," he shouted. "Where are we supposed to go?" I turned my attention to him, my voice calm but firm. "You've been living in a fantasy, Greg. This house was never yours to claim. You've been circling like a vulture, waiting for something that was never going to happen." Lisa stepped in, her tone desperate now. "David, we can talk about this. You didn't have to make such a rash decision. We're your family." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of her words. Family? Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm standing, all I've seen is entitlement and manipulation. You threatened to leave me over this house, Lisa. You made your priorities clear. She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. "And let's not forget your ultimatum. Give him the house or I'll divorce you." "Well, Lisa," I chose. "And now you're going to live with the consequences of your actions." Greg tried to jump in again, but I silenced him with a look. "This conversation doesn't involve you. Pack your things and leave. You have no business here anymore." The weight of my words seemed to hit them both at once. Lisa's face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw something resembling regret in her eyes. But it was too little, too late. Greg, on the other hand, was furious, muttering curses under his breath as he stormed out of the room. Lisa stayed behind, her tone softening as she tried a different tactic. "David, please. Let's talk this through. I know I said things in the heat of the moment, but we can fix this." I shook my head. "There's nothing to fix, Lisa. You made your choice when you put your brother's greed above our marriage, above my parents' legacy. This house deserved better than to be a pawn in your games." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she seemed truly defeated. "Where are we supposed to go?" she whispered. "That's not my concern anymore," I said, standing up. "You wanted control, Lisa. Now you have it, over your own life, not mine." The following days were filled with chaos as Lisa and Greg scrambled to figure out their next move. They tried to stall, claiming they needed more time to pack, but I made it clear that the timeline was non-negotiable. Every box they loaded into their car felt like a step closer to freedom. The day they finally left, I stood on the front porch, watching as they drove away. Lisa didn't look back, but I could see the tension in her posture, the weight of her choices bearing down on her. Greg was sullen and silent, his dreams of an easy life shattered. As their car disappeared down the street, I turned back to the house, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The house wasn't mine anymore, but the legacy it represented was intact. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally move forward. The weeks following the confrontation were a whirlwind of emotions and legal proceedings, as Lisa made good on her promise to push for a divorce. Her threats about regret were hollow to me now, though her actions showed just how deeply she underestimated my resolve. I had no intentions of faltering, not after everything I'd endured. Lisa moved out almost immediately, retreating to Greg's small, cluttered apartment. Their expectations of grandeur had been shattered by the house sale, and her bitterness seeped into every interaction we had after that. Each communication, whether about dividing assets or formalizing our separation, was filled with spiteful accusations and veiled insults. "You betrayed me," she said in one heated email, as though my refusal to bow to her demands had somehow upended her world. But I wasn't shaken. In fact, I had never felt clearer about my decisions. The sale of the house had finalized just in time, ensuring the proceeds were secure in a separate account under my name. The funds represented more than just money. They were the embodiment of my parents' sacrifices, now safe from Lisa and Greg's grasping hands. Lisa, however, wasn't ready to concede defeat. One day, I received a letter from her lawyer claiming I had unfairly liquidated a marital asset without her consent. The laugh I let out echoed in my empty apartment as I forwarded the letter to my attorney. Lisa seemed to have forgotten that the house, legally, had never been hers. It was my inheritance, clearly outlined in my parents' will, and no amount of legal posturing would change that. Meanwhile, Greg's fury spilled over in ridiculous ways. He left angry voicemails, each more incoherent than the last. "You're nothing but a selfish coward," he shouted in one message. "You don't deserve what you have." The irony of a man who had tried to bully me into giving up my family's home calling me selfish wasn't lost on me. I never responded to him. His rants weren't worth my time. The fallout spread beyond just Lisa and Greg. Mutual friends began reaching out, offering condolences and, in some cases, apologies for not recognizing how toxic things had become. "We thought you were happy," one friend confessed during a lunch meeting. "But now that I think about it, Lisa always seemed more concerned with appearances than with your well-being." Hearing those words stung, but they also validated what I had felt for years. Lisa's obsession with status and materialism had overshadowed the love and partnership we once shared. It wasn't just the house that had driven us apart. It was everything the house represented. My loyalty to family, my sense of duty, and my refusal to prioritize greed over values. As the divorce proceedings dragged on, Lisa's behavior grew more erratic. She tried to claim joint ownership of my other assets, despite our prenuptial agreement clearly outlining her limited claims. When that failed, she turned to emotional manipulation, sending messages late at night about how I was tearing our lives apart and destroying any chance of reconciliation. Each message felt like a desperate attempt to regain control, but I refused to engage. Despite the chaos, I found moments of clarity and peace. I started running in the mornings, letting the cool air clear my mind and strengthen my body. I reconnected with friends I had distanced myself from during my marriage, rediscovering the joy of meaningful relationships. Even my work improved. The clarity I felt in my personal life seemed to translate into a renewed focus and creativity in my career. The day of the final divorce hearing arrived with a mix of emotions. Walking into that courtroom felt like stepping into the final chapter of a story I never thought I'd be forced to write. I wasn't angry anymore. Not the burning, unrelenting rage I'd felt in the beginning. Instead, I felt resolute. This was the closure I needed to move forward, the moment I officially severed the toxic bond that had tethered me to a life of manipulation and betrayal. Lisa sat across from me, her expression oscillating between smugness and uncertainty. She'd spent months trying to convince herself and others that she'd somehow been wronged, that I was the villain in her narrative. But as the proceedings unfolded, her facade began to crack. Her lawyer tried to argue for a larger share of the assets, citing her contributions to our marriage, but the prenuptial agreement we'd signed years ago left no room for interpretation. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman who clearly had no patience for theatrics, dismissed their arguments with a few curt words. Lisa's frustration was palpable. She kept shifting in her seat, shooting glances my way as though expecting me to intervene or offer some sort of compromise. But I remained silent, letting my lawyer handle everything. The papers we'd submitted were airtight, the evidence of her attempts to manipulate the situation well documented. She had no leverage, and we both knew it. As the judge reviewed the final terms, I caught myself staring at Lisa, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the person I'd fallen in love with years ago. She had been vibrant, charming, and full of life, qualities that had drawn me in like a moth to a flame. But over time, her charm had turned into manipulation, her vibrancy into entitlement. The love I'd once felt had been eroded by years of selfishness and deceit. When the judge announced her ruling, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. The division of assets was fair, but not in Lisa's favor. She'd receive a modest settlement, enough to rebuild her life, but far from the windfall she and Greg had been counting on. The house, sold and its proceeds secured, remained untouched by her grasping hands. The judge's gavel came down with a finality that echoed in the quiet room. It was over. Lisa approached me in the hallway afterward, her expression a mixture of anger and desperation. "This isn't fair," she hissed. "You're leaving me with nothing." I met her gaze, calm and unwavering. "You made your choices, Lisa," I said evenly. "I just refuse to let you destroy everything my parents worked for." Her eyes flashed with frustration, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. It was a fitting sound, a hollow echo, fading into the distance. The days that followed felt surreal. I kept expecting some lingering sense of regret or sadness to creep in, but it never did. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in years, I was free from the toxicity, the manipulation, and the constant feeling of not being enough. The divorce had been a painful process, but it was also a necessary one. It had forced me to confront the reality of my marriage and make the difficult decisions I'd been avoiding for far too long. I threw myself into my work, channeling my energy into projects that reignited my passion and creativity. I reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with, rediscovering the joy of laughter and camaraderie. My new apartment, though modest compared to the house I'd once called home, became a sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe and focus on rebuilding my life. Word of the divorce spread quickly among our mutual acquaintances. Some were shocked, others unsurprised. Many reached out with words of support, sharing their own observations about Lisa's behavior over the years. "You're better off without her," one friend said bluntly during a dinner catch-up. I couldn't help but agree. As for Lisa, I heard through the grapevine that her relationship with Greg had soured quickly after the divorce. Without the promise of wealth and status, their dynamic shifted, revealing the cracks in their partnership. Greg's true nature, selfish, lazy, and opportunistic, became impossible for Lisa to ignore. Their fall from grace was swift, and while I didn't take pleasure in their misfortune, I couldn't deny the sense of vindication it brought. The divorce had been the end of one chapter, but it also marked the beginning of another. I was no longer defined by the betrayal or the pain Lisa had caused. Instead, I was free to define myself on my own terms. I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward, stronger and wiser than I'd ever been. The days following the divorce were strangely quiet. My life, once filled with tension and arguments, was now defined by an eerie sense of calm. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with the silence. For so long, every moment had been dictated by Lisa's demands, her complaints, or her manipulations. Now, I was free to rebuild my life on my own terms. I moved into a modest apartment across town, far removed from the neighborhood where Lisa and I had lived. The place wasn't much, but it was mine. No memories of broken promises haunted its walls, and I found comfort in the blank slate it provided. I decorated it sparingly, focusing on functionality rather than flair, but each piece of furniture I bought felt like a step toward reclaiming my independence. The first night in my new home, I sat on the couch with a drink in hand, staring out the window at the city lights. It hit me then, I wasn't sad. I wasn't mourning the end of my marriage or longing for what could have been. Instead, I felt relieved. The weight of years of emotional strain had lifted, leaving me lighter than I'd felt in ages. I threw myself into work with renewed focus, determined to channel my energy into something productive. My boss noticed the change almost immediately. "You're on fire lately," he said during a meeting. "Keep this up, and you're looking at a promotion." The praise felt good, but what mattered more was the sense of purpose I'd regained. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I was building a future for myself. Friends I hadn't seen in years started reaching out, many of them offering belated words of support. I always thought Lisa was too controlling, one old friend confessed over coffee. But I didn't want to say anything and overstep. I appreciated their honesty, even if it came late. Their encouragement reminded me that I wasn't as alone as I'd felt during the marriage. Meanwhile, Lisa and Greg's world seemed to unravel. Mutual acquaintances whispered about the cracks in their relationship, noting how Greg had started to distance himself from Lisa once the reality of her financial situation set in. Without access to the wealth she'd anticipated, Lisa's charm began to fade in Greg's eyes. It wasn't long before their relationship dissolved entirely, leaving Lisa scrambling to pick up the pieces. One afternoon, I received a call from a mutual friend who'd run into Lisa at a grocery store. "She looked rough," they said hesitantly. "She asked about you, you know? She said she hoped you were doing well." I thanked them for letting me know but didn't dwell on it. Lisa's regret, while unsurprising, no longer had the power to affect me. She'd made her choices, and I had no intention of revisiting the past. What surprised me most during this time was how much I began to value my own company. I rediscovered hobbies I'd set aside during my marriage: reading, hiking, even painting. On weekends, I'd drive out to nearby trails, spending hours in nature and relishing the peace it brought. It was during one of these hikes that I realized I'd stopped thinking about Lisa altogether. The pain she'd caused no longer defined me. I was moving forward, one step at a time. One evening, as I was sorting through some old boxes, I stumbled upon a photo album from the early days of our marriage. Flipping through the pages, I saw smiles that now felt hollow, moments that had once seemed genuine but were now tinged with the knowledge of what would come. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sadness, not for Lisa, but for the man I'd been. He'd been naive, too trusting, and blind to the signs. But he'd also been kind, hopeful, and full of love. I realized then that I didn't need to bury that part of myself. Instead, I could honor it by carrying those qualities into my future, tempered by the lessons I'd learned. The turning point came when I decided to host a small gathering at my new apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few friends, some drinks, and good conversation. For the first time in years, I laughed without reservation, surrounded by people who cared about me for who I was, not what I could provide. That night, as the last guest left, I stood in my living room and felt something I hadn't in a long time: contentment. Lisa and Greg's betrayal had shaken me to my core, but it hadn't broken me. In fact, it had forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding and make decisions I'd been too scared to face. The aftermath of the divorce wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. It was a chance to rebuild, to redefine myself, and to reclaim my happiness. As I fell asleep that night, I felt a quiet sense of pride. I'd survived the storm and come out stronger on the other side. The life I was building wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. Months had passed since I last thought about Lisa. My life had found its rhythm. Work, hobbies, and spending time with new friends had filled the void her betrayal once left. I was no longer the man she had left behind. I was stronger, happier, and more self-assured. But life, as unpredictable as ever, had one final twist waiting for me. One crisp Saturday afternoon, I decided to visit the mall to pick up a few things for my apartment. It wasn't a place I frequented often, but I was in no rush and thought browsing the stores might be a nice change of pace. I was midway through selecting a new set of coffee mugs when I heard a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. "Michael." I froze, the familiarity of her tone sending an involuntary chill down my spine. Turning slowly, I saw Lisa standing a few feet away, a shopping bag dangling from her hand. She looked different. Her once perfectly styled hair now hung limp, and the confidence that had always been her defining feature seemed to have dimmed. For a brief moment, I didn't know how to react. Should I ignore her? Walk away? But before I could decide, she spoke again. "I didn't think I'd run into you here." Her voice wavered slightly, and I could see the discomfort written all over her face. She hadn't expected to see me either, at least, not like this. Dressed sharply in a tailored coat, holding bags from stores that reflected my renewed confidence, I must have been the last person she thought would look so put together. I could say the same, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. For a moment, there was an awkward silence. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around as if searching for something to say. "You look good," she finally managed, her words hesitant and almost forced. "Thanks," I said simply, offering a polite smile. "You too." It wasn't entirely true. While she didn't look unkempt, there was a weariness about her that hadn't been there before, a heaviness that clung to her like a shadow. "So," she began, her voice tinged with an awkward laugh, "how have you been?" I considered the question carefully, then decided honesty was the best approach. "I've been doing well. Work's great, and life's been peaceful." Her expression faltered slightly, as if the word peaceful had struck a nerve. I couldn't help but wonder if she realized that the peace I spoke of had come after removing her and her chaos from my life. "I'm glad," she said, though the words lacked conviction. Before the conversation could grow more uncomfortable, Sarah appeared. She was carrying a bag from a bookstore, her smile lighting up the moment she saw me. "Hey, sorry I took so long," she said, slipping her arm around mine. Then she noticed Lisa and hesitated, her expression polite but curious. "And you are?" Sarah asked, her tone neutral but firm. Lisa seemed taken aback, her eyes flicking between Sarah and me. "I'm just an old friend," she stammered, clearly unsure of how to introduce herself. "Lisa, this is Sarah," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Sarah, this is Lisa." The moment hung heavy in the air as realization dawned on Lisa's face. She understood now. Sarah wasn't just a friend or a casual acquaintance. She was my partner, someone who had stepped into my life and filled the void Lisa had left behind. "It's nice to meet you," Sarah said, her tone warm but with an undertone of quiet strength. Lisa nodded, clearly flustered. "You too." The conversation quickly petered out after that. Lisa muttered something about needing to be somewhere and excused herself, leaving Sarah and me to continue our day. As we walked away, Sarah glanced up at me. "That was her, wasn't it?" I nodded. "Yep." "She looked like she'd seen a ghost," Sarah said with a soft laugh. "Maybe she did," I replied, smiling. But deep down, I wasn't laughing. The encounter had stirred emotions I thought I'd buried. Regret, anger, sadness, but none of them were overwhelming. Instead, I felt a surprising sense of closure. Seeing Lisa again, so diminished compared to the person she had been, confirmed what I already knew. I was better off without her. As Sarah and I left the mall, I couldn't help but feel grateful for how far I'd come. Lisa's betrayal had broken me once, but it had also forced me to rebuild myself into someone stronger, someone better. Seeing her now, lost in the wake of her own choices, was a stark reminder of the path I could have taken had I not chosen to rise above it all. And for that, I felt nothing but peace. As Sarah and I left the mall, I felt lighter, as if I had finally shed the last remnants of a life that no longer belonged to me. Seeing Lisa again wasn't just a random coincidence. It was the final chapter of a story I had struggled to close for so long. And now, with the pen firmly in my hand, I was ready to write a new narrative, one where I was no longer defined by betrayal or loss. Life with Sarah was different. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about consistency, warmth, and respect. She saw me for who I was, flaws and all, and embraced the journey we were on together. Every day with her reminded me of the kind of love I had always hoped for but had never truly experienced until now. In the weeks after running into Lisa, I reflected on how far I had come. 2 years ago, I was drowning in pain, questioning everything about myself, and unsure if I'd ever find solid ground again. The betrayal had been a storm that tore through my life, leaving destruction in its wake. But that storm also cleared the path for new growth, for new opportunities, and for a version of myself I could genuinely be proud of. I poured my energy into building a life that felt authentic. My career continued to thrive, with the consulting business reaching milestones I had only dreamed of before. The confidence I gained from my professional achievements spilled over into other areas of my life. I started traveling again, visiting places I'd once avoided because they reminded me of the plans Lisa and I had made together. Now, those destinations were mine alone to explore, filled with new memories that had nothing to do with the past. Sarah became my partner in every sense of the word. She supported my ambitions, celebrated my victories, and stood by me through challenges. But more than that, she encouraged me to embrace the quieter moments, the laughter over a shared joke, the comfort of sitting together in silence, the simple joy of knowing someone truly cared. It wasn't just my relationship with Sarah that flourished. Reconnecting with friends and family had been a vital part of my healing journey. People who had stood by me during my darkest days now saw a version of me they'd long hoped would emerge, happier, stronger, and more grounded. Occasionally, I'd hear snippets about Lisa from mutual acquaintances. Her relationship with her lover, the man she had chosen over me, had fallen apart not long after our divorce. The life she had envisioned, filled with excitement and passion, had crumbled under the weight of reality. She was left to navigate the aftermath of her choices, grappling with the consequences of her actions. I didn't feel anger or resentment toward her anymore. In fact, I felt nothing at all. Lisa was a chapter in my life that had ended, and I had no desire to revisit it. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. The difference was, my choices led me to a place of peace and fulfillment. One evening, as Sarah and I sat on the balcony of our apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about how different life could have been?" I knew what she meant without needing clarification. Sometimes, I admitted. But then I remember that everything, good and bad, led me here, and I wouldn't change a thing. She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. Me neither. In that moment, I realized that my story wasn't just about overcoming betrayal or finding love again. It was about rediscovering who I was, reclaiming my worth, and learning to embrace life with open arms. Lisa's betrayal had been a devastating blow, but it had also been the catalyst for my transformation. It forced me to confront my vulnerabilities, to grow in ways I never thought possible, and to build a life that was truly my own. As Sarah and I sat there, content in the simplicity of the moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the pain, but for the resilience it had forged within me. My life was no longer defined by what I had lost. It was defined by what I had gained. And as I looked toward the future, I knew one thing for certain. The best chapters of my story were still ahead.